So with flat Earth, you do get the correlation with alchemy and the ancients, and astrology would be an offshoot. It's more so prioritized in the highest sense. It's not the of utmost importance. It's like one of these Greek philosophers said, Anaximenes, I believe, but he said, "Of what use is the studying of the stars when I have nothing before me but slavery or death?" And that's pretty much the truth because regardless of what your sign is, blah blah, we are pretty much at the same predicament. Survival is pretty much submit to some type of service or duty or occupation, or suffer with the threat of starvation in the extreme sense. So, who cares whether you're Cancer or Leo? You pretty much, when it comes to the critical matters of existence, I mean, it's pretty much the same. So that's what he's saying. What's the point? So astrology wouldn't be, that's just more like a selfish obsession with your own, transitory personality. You're talking about an insignificant personality if you can see through it. When you really want to get into, especially alchemy at a higher level, you got to start seeing through your individuality, because it's pretty much drowning in a sea of conditions and causes that it would not exist without. So, alchemy, again, in the highest sense, goes beyond astrology and materials, of course. But with flat Earth, of course, it makes more sense because you talk about heaven and earth, and I heard some people talk about going to the center of the Earth. There's an inner sun, maybe, and physically, empirically speaking, possibly. There was this one book that guy Flatwater he was reading from, and there was a Voyager. He wasn't quite sure if it was fiction or not, but it was supposedly I think it was supposedly nonfiction. But this sailor or whatever and his son ended up at the center of the flat Earth plane, and they said at first, it was extremely cold heading toward the center, but then it became tropical. And I believe they went through a whirlpool. And yeah, I think then they got a little fictitious. And they started talking about they met this, I guess, these peoples are already living in the center, and they are sort of underground and whatever. That's a story. And then there's also the theory of the sun being a hidden sun in the inner Earth. Now, in alchemical terms, you got to remember Earth would be the body. In some cases, the lower body. And esoterically, it's the entire body. Exoterically, it's the lower body. And then the mind, esoterically, would be heaven or the spirit, some would say. Exoterically, the mind would be the upper body. The brain, even the heart, though. The heart also. Above the navel. Then you're getting towards heaven. That corresponds, of course, with flat Earth. You're not talking about spheres and in an infinite sea of just infinite vacuum of nothingness. So when you have a plane and you have then you have what sort of like a yolk upright in the middle of the eggshell is what this plane would be. That it sits upright. The terrestrial plane, we sit upright in the middle, and it's like an egg. They called it in a cosmic egg in half. In a sense, you can look at the top half as heaven. Of course, we actually do live in the heavens in a sense because of the air, but of course, we're not in the clouds. We're in the mud, but yet and still, you have this sort of division. You talk about clouds, mist, and then you get down to the gritty, grindy blood and mud. So there's a contrast between heaven and earth, and that corresponds to upper body and lower body. Then you have the sun and the moon, which correspond to the eyes in alchemy. They correspond to the left and right eyes. I forget which, whatever, you can look it up. And then you have the stars, of course, which correspond to the mind. You could also look at those exoterically as the brain. If you look at one of those neuron maps that they produced, you can see all those points, those light points. It's sort of like the stars. And that's when you get into astrology and its particulars, depending on certain characteristics depending on birth dates and how they calculate it. So it has a reality to it, but it's just not the ultimate reality, in a sense that this is not the ultimate reality. So astrology wouldn't be that, but it plays a role for sure. And it corresponds, like I said. So you have the sun and moon, the left and right. These go into an internal alchemy, actually. And then you have the stars, which correspond to the mind. Okay, then you have the earth. And of course, that corresponds to the lower body. You have the mud. You have food and excrement, basically. That's below the navel, which is an alchemy, of course. You're trying to transmute earth into heaven. You can look at it that way. As they say, transmute lead to gold. The lead would be the earth. That's what you get in, enlightenment, the crown chakra, the golden light, the pineal gland. You're trying to transmute this earth-based, which is, like I said, esoterically, the entire body is considered earth. And then you have the spirit mind, which is heaven. In Taoism, first talk about a union between heaven and earth. And then ultimately, actually, this even collapses into something beyond heaven and earth. So then it becomes what they call oblivion, which they look upon as, in Buddhism, of course, it's nothingness. It's oblivion. And from their perspective, that's the advantageous state, if you want to call it a state. It's a non-state. Is the most auspicious. They hold that as, the supreme value, and they see this, from the alchemical point of view, this scenario is of inferior value. And there's a quote here. This is from a book, The World of Thought in Ancient China. And they talk about, he's talking about a quote from Lao Tzu, because Lao Tzu says, the reason that I have trouble is that I have a body. If I had no body, what troubles would I have? Now, a lot of authors have tried to reinterpret this in a sense and try to make some concessions for what he's saying. What he's saying is pretty obviously there's the hidden gem of a gnosis, or as I call enlightened pessimism. He's telling you outright, this is the great matter, as I mentioned, and he's addressing it and he's just stating the facts. So he talks about here, there's an author here, he's making a comment on it. He says how, some authors thought, well, why would he say that? I thought he was a pro-life optimist. But then this author here who's writing this book, he says, well, actually, survival may be the supreme goal in life, but to the man of gnosis who was able to identify with non-being, life itself with this ever-present threat of trouble is not the supreme value. So, I mean, you're basically always in a state of endangerment. You're always threatened with something. I mean, even it's just the power cutting off. Like, we've adapted to having electricity now to the point where if the electricity goes off, you feel like you're lacking severely lacking. So, like, life is, it's pretty much interrupted to a point where you really can't live that long like that without taking a drastic hit. So we just adapt to that. And that's because you're threatened all the time with having to face the elements, basically, and your own bodily deficiencies. So this scenario is not held in high regard, when you add the fact that it's terminal. So, it's not the supreme goal. In other words, their supreme goal, again, is just regaining the non-being, the state pre-birth, and remaining there. Because since you can't stop the cessation of the body, the psychophysical organism, you can't stop its deterioration. A lot of these guys were, because these are the wise. So, the wise don't talk like your aunts and uncles, people who are just basically, I hate to say it, but they're just waiting to die. It's pretty blunt, but that's the truth. These are the wise. So it's gonna come, but a lot of these systems, these guys can get into states where, and some of these guys could actually just leave. And I know a lot of you may have seen that picture, that mummy's body that was well preserved, because he pretty much he got to a high stage of chi cultivation, and he left through the center of the earth, and that's where I was getting at. But very few can achieve that. The center of the earth would be, again, exoterically, it would be the center of the body, the navel, because that's where the generation started. But then again, it was metaphysical, so it wasn't necessarily in the navel. But you would correspond to that area esoterically and say, well, the center of the earth is how we escape. And he did indeed escape that way. And his body was preserved to a high degree. But that's how he chose to go. They call it going quietly. So he escaped to the center of the earth. And that's what they mean, essentially, at its foundation. And I'm talking about this science goes back, ages. That's the real interpretation of it. It's not so much you're gonna, come on. Where would you go? How would you take this body? You're gonna have to take food rations. Again, you're gonna take this constantly needy body somewhere else. Is gonna be a problem. It's gonna create more problems. So nah, you got to get rid of that way of thinking to even realize what's really being talked about here. So again, with flat Earth, the alchemy makes even more sense also, and it just brings more truth to this. I know a lot of people, a lot of flat earthers, of course, may not be, because you have all these factions, and flat Earth can actually enlighten a lot of different factions, but then they reject it also. So it's just, it's pretty frustrating sometimes. But at the same time, I do see a lot of people, starting to get into flat Earth. But of course, it just makes them even more excited about living on this plane. And so you also had in Jainism, they depicted the universe, the cosmos, and of course we use those terms, and they, some of the authors would translate the terms they use into these terms. But again, we know now there's no universe as space and galaxies, no cosmos and solar systems or whatever, but the cosmos would be the world system, but they depicted it as sometimes a woman or either a man, and the middle of the man or woman would be this plane of Earth, and then as you go higher up the man or woman, it would be you're getting to the firmament, you're getting more into the mind, brilliance, the stars, you know how that corresponds. But you go lower, you get into the lower regions of the body, again the food, the excrement, then the feet, on down, the earth energies, that's where you correspond to the hells. So that's how they depicted this in their theology. They were saying, well, below this plane, there are hells. Above here, there are heavens. Now, of course, that's a theology, that's a religion, but just to point out the fact that even there, it corresponded to flat earth. Because again, with Jainism, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, all of these systems, isms, a lot of them, you basically are talking about, at its foundation, you're talking about the same thing, which everybody talks about now, but doesn't really understand, the bigger picture, the whole context of it. It all relates to alchemy, the internal alchemy. And again, that got degraded into actual physical stones and minerals. And then also what you have, and a lot of times with some of these Western systems, they're too rigid and intellectualized. So they miss the subtle keys also. And they get into basically excessive logic, which is like an idling engine when it comes to the metaphysic. So it misses the mark. Yet and still, even those schools, I believe, a lot of those schools do understand flat Earth. And of course, you have that famous picture of the sorcerer, I believe, or whatever, but he's reaching outside of the dome. And that's used for a lot of hermeticists or whatever. So flat Earth is, I wouldn't say it's esoteric because it's just the reality of the situation, but a lot of people who are into esoterics, I know they would have an easier time accepting it. And yet there can be nothing more esoteric than alchemy. And again, alchemy does correlate to the flat Earth realm. Peace.